Welcome, Stuart.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Sorry to come in here at the last minute. Literally.
Well, you're here. So I had already planned how Tracy and I and Amanda would have a dialogue about your book if something had happened, but we're delighted and we'll catch up at the end of the night. And yeah, so those of you who would like to be seen, we invite you to allow your video to become operative. And those of you who would kindly keep yourself muted until the appropriate time, that would also be nice in case your dog starts to bark or something of that order. And I'll just, as people continue to pile on, I'll talk a little bit about our work here at Loyola Marymount University before formally introducing Stuart Ray Sarbacker. And Loyola Marymount University, almost exactly 20 years ago, launched the first of what are now 6 different certificate programs through the university's Center for Religion and Spirituality. And this initiative was undertaken because of a perceived need. And as you may recall, and I'm sure I know all the details are in this book that will be our focus tonight, but the Jesuits were in the yogis were in Los Angeles before the Jesuits. Swami Vivekananda actually wrote Raja Yoga while living in Pasadena, California in the 1890s. And it was not until 1911 that the Jesuits became part of the spiritual landscape here in Los Angeles. And Paramahansa Yogananda had established this marvelous community and multiple meditation centers throughout Southern California, starting in the 1920s. And what happened with the sadness of anti-Asian bias in the 1920s, partly out of fear regarding people such as Paramahansa Yogananda, laws were passed forbidding people of Asian origin to be in the United States, with the exception of the Japanese. And that's a whole other story. But between 1920 and 1965, the immigration possibility was closed. So those yogis who got established early, thankfully were not deported. But it was not until the culture shift of the 1960s that yoga began to gain a really wide popularity. And yoga teachers from India were once more, after a 45-year lag, more or less, allowed to come into this country, including, my wife just joined us on screen here. She and I studied very closely for 12 years at Yoga Anand Ashram with a teacher who came during the period of the early wave, the second wave of yoga teachers. And she created a community that trained a number of us, dedicated almost exactly 50 years ago in 1972. And then in the 1980s, after the counterculture and all of these alternative communities and these new flashy gurus landed here, some of them turned out to be rascals, and there was a lot of period of scandal. And in the 1980s, because of the real boosterism among capitalists, there was a like, we got to stop this. And there was a sort of a cultural backlash against alternative lifestyles. And what happened, I call that sort of the quiet phase from the 80s into the early 90s. And then this moment happened where women gurus came into prominence. A woman from South India, Amici, many of you know her as the hugging guru, gained popularity in the 90s. And a number of people began to travel to India to study primarily with the disciples of Krishnamacharya. And they studied with Patabi Joyce, they studied with Deshikachar, Krishnamacharya's own son. They studied with BKS Iyengar. And during that period in India, the academic study of yoga began at a place called SVS near the city of Bangalore. And in the 90s, as this, I'll call it the third wave of yoga was getting underway, a number of people sort of came to me and said, can you help? And I thought, here, I'm in Los Angeles, but as I sort of quickly discovered, the existing centers that had been established in the 1890s and the 1920s were a little bit flash frozen in time. And I remember sitting in pews and thinking, is this yoga? And sitting in funeral parlor chairs and thinking, I want to sit on the floor. And that these places did not use Sanskrit because part of their like evolution was to appeal to the all-American audience of the 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And it was this second wave that began to really interrogate. And then the third wave people, I'm qualifying myself as a true elder here, began to say, hey, you know some stuff, why don't you? So we started with a certificate in yoga philosophy. We then added a certificate in yoga and ecology, which is now yoga, mindfulness, and social change. Dr. Larry Payne came and convinced us to start what became a 4-year sequence in yoga therapy. We affiliated with the Yoga Ed program started by Tara Guber. We began a 200-hour teacher training, yoga and the health sciences. And we also, for now it's close to 17 years, have had in residence the only really surviving senior teacher of the Krishnamacharya tradition, Sri Vatsa Ramaswamy. Just a remarkable and prolific resource. And back in the 90s, I kept on going to my deans and saying, hey, we have all these great, talented, wonderful people. We need to have a graduate program. And they said, no, but you can do certificates. So after several years and several hundreds of completed certificates, the university came back around and said, why don't you start a graduate program? And I said, what a great idea. So we just enrolled, and many of you are here tonight, our 9th cohort of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And we are accepting applications for the 10th cohort. And we're moving also toward launching a PhD program in contemplative justice leadership that will allow people to continue with their yoga and marry it with additional perspectives to be qualified as a PhD holder. So lots of good things happening. And along the way, and I don't remember if it was the 80s or the 90s, but this very energetic young person in graduate school, I was walking down the hall at one of these anonymous big hotels at the convention of the American Academy of Religion. And Stuart said to me, it was the first time we met, and he said, but where should I do my yoga training? And I said, well, and I think he took my advice. I recommended the Shivananda experience. And he went forward valiantly at University of Wisconsin, working with some truly remarkable people. And his dissertation was on samadhi. I mean, like, I started at ground zero. Like, what do you do with the agony of being a human being? But he just goes straight to the top and did a comparative study of samadhi in Tibetan Buddhist traditions and in yoga traditions, and has been really sought after as an expert by yoga practitioners globally, and has spent the last few years putting together this wonderful book that is now, as of cohort 9, the textbook for the beginning of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And this book, Tracing the Path of Yoga, which I had the good fortune to read in manuscript form, does it all in a very up-to-date, very clear, accessible manner. It speculates, and that's all we can do, about the origins of yoga. As yoga becomes textually defined, he gives the summary of the various ages and stages where yoga finds voice. And he brings us through the various movements of the medieval period, including the rise of the Hatha Yoga traditions, right up to tonight. So Stuart has taught at Loyola, Chicago. He has taught at Northwestern University. He is now tenured associate professor at Oregon State up in Salem. And it's just so delightful to welcome him to be with us this evening. So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you so much, Chris. And what a nice introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's okay with you. And we'll jump into things here. Let's see. Can everybody see the screen now? Yes, excellent. And I'm gonna get you all in the gallery mode over here so I can feel like I'm speaking to real live people here. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and it means especially much to be here at speaking to the LMU Yoga Studies MA program. In fact, I thought I would start my talk out with some acknowledgements, as well as talking about the precursors and inspiration for the work. And so I'm going to start by acknowledging Chris's deep influence and impact on my work and on my life, really, to tell you the truth. Chris told this the story about meeting at the American Academy of Religion meeting, probably 20 or so years ago. And I was actually planning to tell the exact same story, but tell it from the viewpoint of a kind of lowly graduate student who is interested in all things yoga, came across along the way some of Chris's work, and just was really inspired and thought, wow, people do this kind of work. This is really exciting. And so I sort of worked up to the gumption to introduce myself at the AAR conference. And like Chris was saying, these can be very impersonal meetings. In some cases, you are, given the minimal amount of attention by more senior people if you're not considered somehow important. But Chris really engaged me with open arms, let's say. In fact, I remember that first meeting, he said, you know what, after this session, we're going to go to lunch. Why don't you come with us? And so he took me to lunch with another scholar that many of you are probably familiar with, Ian Witcher, who at the time had just written this very provocative book on yoga philosophy that was really kind of getting some traction and taking off. And it was just an extraordinary experience, to just be welcomed into the field of yoga studies. And between reading Chris's work, and I've thrown a few examples up on this slide, And really having Chris as a colleague and advocate in the field and in my career, I wouldn't be where I am now if it weren't for him on all sorts of different levels. And I just want to acknowledge that. On an academic level, one of the sort of humorous things I've come to appreciate over the years is it seems like whenever I have a really novel idea and I start doing a little bit of research on it, it turns out Chris has already done it, or at least done some preliminary work that, again, is a great sort of foundation to build upon or to take in a different direction. And so, whether it's his work on nonviolence, yoga and ecology, his work on the relationship between yoga and Jain philosophy, he's kind of done it all, and I really I'm inspired by his sort of his innovative and kind of path making work in the field. So thank you so much, Chris. Being here is really an honor, and I appreciate it so much. So along with Chris's work, there are a number of different things that really kind of inspired me to go down the road I've gone with this particular book. And so I've thrown together a collection of a few different works that are in some respects summative about the history and philosophy of yoga, that along the way have provided at least signposts to me in terms of my own thinking and my own development. And of course, one of the major looming works in this field is Mircea Eliade's Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom, which I read as a graduate student and really kind of transformed my understanding of yoga and really stoked my interest quite deeply in the field. And it was one of the things that really got me rolling. And one of the things I really loved about it was its attempt to be summative and to really encapsulate a kind of historical arc of yoga traditions. But, at this point in time, it was written in the 1950s and revised maybe once or twice. It's really shown its age, I would say, over the past couple of decades, especially given all of the innovative research that's being done on both medieval and modern yoga. Eliade's book sort of ends in such a way that you would think the modern era was just an extension of these earlier classical and medieval periods, when, as we know, through the work of many different scholars, that's not the case. That yoga is a kind of living entity that's really developed in very unique and important ways within the modern era. Another book, I would say, among other reasons, I just absolutely love the title of Georg Feuerstein's Yoga, the Technology of Ecstasy. I think he really nailed it with that title. And again, that was a book I read early on, along with his later work, which really, to some extent, was a revision of this work, the yoga tradition, which also aimed at being a kind of summative work. But I think, most scholars would agree it's not really a scholarly academic work. It's really, I think, looking more to speak to a practitioner community, and is a bit cumbersome as a introductory work on yoga for all its virtues. Other works, including the work of David White, who's down at Santa Barbara. I think, Chris, did he just retire recently, or did I hear word that he retired? So he's been a real leading figure in the field too, and influenced my work. Gavin Flood wrote an excellent textbook on Hinduism, which does a great job of really comprehensively surveying the field. And for those of you who want a kind of deeper understanding of Hinduism, that's a great text. Gavin and I sort of started a conversation, which in part led to him encouraging me to do this project. And so I kind of, have an appreciation for both his work and for his encouragement. A few other things here. Jeffrey Samuel more recently wrote this text, The Origins of Yoga and Tantra, which really aims at being a counterpart to Eliade's work, telling the political history of yoga, how it ties into social, economic, and other factors, more so than really looking at the yoga as a kind of, doctrinal, ritual, practical discourse. And so I think if you're looking for the kind of nuts and bolts of yoga practice, you're probably better set looking at Eliade's work. On the other hand, if you want more of a political, social narrative, Samuel's book is a great resource. And part of what I see myself doing in Tracing the Path of Yoga is sort of navigating those extremes of either just simply kind of describing what practitioners say and do versus providing a kind of historical context to understand that, yes, doctrine and practice are critical parts of the picture, but there are these other historical, political, economic, and other sorts of issues that come into play. Another text that I actually had used previously was Peter Connolly's Student's Guide to the History and Philosophy of Yoga, which again is a great kind of short introduction to some of the key themes in yoga, but I thought could use some fleshing out in portions. We've got Davidson's Indian Esoteric Buddhism, which really I think has been an extremely influential book in terms of thinking about both Hindu and Buddhist Tantra. And then you have work such as D. Michaelis's work, and Singleton, and Mallinson's work. And of course, many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the work being done at SOAS on the history of both modern and Hatha yoga traditions. That's really unraveled so many elements and aspects of yoga that really are bringing new vistas into view. And I really couldn't have written the work that I did here without really standing on their shoulders to some extent. So one twist on all of this is, I don't know if anyone has noticed, but there's a kind of similarity here between the covers of these two books. And you may know that this is actually an image of Chakra Samvara, a Buddhist tantric deity, which with his consort Varavahi here. One can't help but think Samuel was doing a bit of a wink here to Eliade's book on the cover. So you might ask, like, why, Stuart, didn't you as well use the Chakra Samvara? And the funny thing is that I didn't intend this, but it only dawned upon me later that Vajrasattva, who's a Buddha figure within Mahayana Buddhism, and especially in the contemporary context in Tibetan Buddhism, is actually often viewed as a purification deity who figures quite prominently within the Chakra Samvara Tantra. So strange coincidence. But part of the reason I chose that image is, one, because it reflects a kind of idea of a idealized practitioner, that Vajrasattva in this form represents a kind of Buddha of purification and an embodiment of the effort of the practice of yoga. And so I thought, both in terms of being a kind of inspiring image, but also representing something very important about yoga, I thought it would be a good choice. So, so the structure of the book I'll talk about next, but I've just remembered, I want to just quickly tell you a story before I move on about my relationship with Chris and the places that it has taken me. So I'm trying to think, about 10 years ago, the World Sanskrit Conference was held in New Delhi. And I thought, if I'm going to go to New Delhi for this conference, I should tack on some sort of research project. And so I talked to Chris, and Chris said, you know what? I know Swami Rama, who's at the Swami Vedabharati, who's at the Swami Rama Sadhak Rama up in Rishikesh. And why don't you get in touch with them? Tell them I recommended that you talk to them and see if you can, pay a visit up there and do some research. And Swami Vedabharati was, was a really interesting character, both a renouncer that really practiced a kind of applied version of Patanjali's yoga, but he'd also actually been an academic scholar for, I think, a couple of decades and wrote voluminous translations and commentaries on the Yoga Sutras. So really interesting scholar, really interesting practitioner. I thought, this sounds great. So they set me up with my own sort of hut on the grounds there, which was actually quite nice. It even had a little heater, air conditioner, and relatively upscale for a retreat center. Comfortable, but not overly indulgent, let's say. It wasn't a spa. Let me just put it that way. But it was great. And so he invited me to both their public sessions. He set me up with a meditation teacher to kind of show me some of the essentials one-on-one of their asana, pranayama, and meditation practice. But one of the most important and interesting things was I got invited to have dinner with Swami Vedabharati every night for my entire stay there. So each night I would go up to his residence. We'd go up to the top floor. We had a kitchen. And every night he would have a kind of subset of the community up there to have dinner together. So one night we were up there and we'd have these really informal but so interesting sort of philosophical conversations about anything and everything related to yoga. It was just it felt very indulgent philosophically in certain respects, very edifying. So one night the chef called out, "Oh, we've got a special tonight. I made pizza." And those of you who have traveled internationally know how sometimes it's really great to get a taste of your home country or your home cuisine. And so how exciting, we're going to have pizza. So eventually the pizza comes out and I take one bite of that pizza and I get that unmistakable crunch of a chili pepper. And my mouth just explodes with fire. And as I continue to eat this piece of pizza, I realize the thing is just loaded with chili peppers. And so after a while, I've sort of got beads of sweat forming on my forehead. And I'm guessing my face probably was red, but I was bound and determined, to sort of meet the bar of hospitality that had been set. And I slowly but surely ate that piece of pizza. And just as I reached that moment of relief, the chef reached over my shoulder and plopped another piece of pizza on my plate. And so it was a bit of a trial by fire of sorts, literally that night. And, it's one of those lessons you learn about, that this is a philosophy, but it's happening within a particular cultural context, let's say. And so it in some respects, as some of you have probably experienced, when you eat enough of those chilies, you almost enter into an altered state of consciousness, if you know what I mean. And so I was definitely, flying high on the chili peppers that night. So just a great example of the roads that Chris Chappell has sent me down over the course of my career here. Well, getting back to the book, I want to talk just a little bit about how I structured the book and what I was really sort of trying to do in terms of building this narrative within the text. So one of the challenges, of course, is the language one, the linguistic challenge of really relating these concepts in as close to the kind of conceptual semantic framework that they come out of. And fortunately, for help on this, I actually looked to one of Chris Chappell's earlier works with Winthrop Sargent, where they did this great guide to pronunciation of Sanskrit terms. And I hope that's been a resource to you as you've been looking at this text. Part of my thinking was, to the degree to which I could put the Sanskrit terms out there and really make it transparent throughout the text, it would mean that you as a reader or whoever was reading it would be just like one step closer to that source material, as well as providing a kind of reference work where you could say, when the Eightfold Path is discussed in Buddhism. What are the Sanskrit terms, or what are the Pali terms that they're using to relate these? Or in various contexts, what are the actual Sanskrit terms used to talk about practice? I'm a real believer that the more you know those primary language terms, the better and deeper your comprehension of it is going to be. And so in some cases, it might be a bit overwhelming that there's just so many terms being thrown at you as a reader, but it creates a bit of an immersion type of experience. And I hope there may be some people who read through the book and find that a bit challenging, but in the end, come out of it thinking like, actually, that was quite worthwhile to go through that, as painstaking as it seemed at times. And so in terms of the structure of the book, I really struggled initially to think about, like, do I want to go with the kind of strict historical arc? Do I want to be thematic in my orientation? How is it best to present this material? And what I did was sort of compromise, that I tried to follow generally a chronological development framework, while at the same time recognizing that it made sense, for example, to focus in on the dynamics of Patanjali yoga and Ashtanga yoga and separate, say, the classical Shramana traditions into another unit. I also thought it was really important that not only we talk about the kind of philosophical, doctrinal traditions, but also that narrative be brought into the picture. And I'm a real believer, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, that looking at, for example, the Hindu Puranas is a huge resource for understanding how yoga was understood more broadly than just the kind of elite philosophical traditions, and to some extent, maybe a more accurate window into how these things were actually put into practice in their historical context. So there's a bit of jumping around, but generally I'm trying to kind of follow this historical narrative, building up to the point where once you get to that section on modern yoga, you should really have the building blocks for understanding where these things are coming from that are, appearing within the context of at least modern yoga traditions that appeal to their traditional precursors. Now, it's a challenge. It is a real challenge in a work like this to balance that kind of desire to go into the kind of technical detail that is going to be more accurate, flesh out concepts, flesh out historical context in more detail, versus the desire to be comprehensive. And I struggled throughout the writing of the text, I struggled through the revisions to really find that balance. And one of the ways I found it was by pushing some of the more detailed discussions into the footnotes. And so I would encourage you, if there's a topic that you feel like you really wanted to go more deeply on, look at the notes, because often the notes take you into the work of other scholars who have looked at an issue at much more length, or I give you a side note that maybe contextualizes a statement in a way that I can't do in the text, because I'm trying to kind of keep on track and not, waver too much. So hopefully, I've done my best to thread the needle there, but it was a real challenge. So along those lines, one of the things I think is most important about this work, at least from, the standpoint of how I view it as a success or failure, is in terms of thinking about things like how we define yoga. And as many of you know, and especially those of you who are, at least dipping their toes into these academic discussions, definitions are, making definitions is a thorny sort of proposition, in part because, again, you're caught in this tension between a kind of specificity that really tells you what something is and what does not fit into that category, versus kind of opening it up and providing a breadth that really captures a wider field of data. And so again, I've tried to kind of thread the needle here in terms of looking at how you define yoga. And so part of this comes out of really looking at the wide span of things historically here represented in the contemporary context that we talk about as yoga, whether it is disciplines, what we broadly call tapas, developing a kind of ascetic heat through the kind of the friction of the sort of the spirit and body, whether it's engaging in various ritual practices, bodily disciplines. These are all things that have deep, deep roots in Indian history, going back as far as the Vedic era. But what about this? What about modern postural yoga, the sorts of yogas that figures like BKS Iyengar brought to a transnational audience and really valorized in the 20th century? Or for that matter, perhaps more Euro-American stylized practices of yoga. Of course, we have the same triangle pose represented here, but a very different cultural context, a different way of thinking about and framing postural yoga practice. Or for that matter, what does it mean when the Prime Minister of India stands in front of thousands of Indian citizens in the streets in New Delhi to celebrate the International Day of Yoga? But what about other forms of yoga? What about Buddhist yogas? What about Sikh forms of yoga or Jain yogas? Or for that matter, Jewish or Christian forms of yoga, or Islamic adaptations of yoga? Yoga is many faceted. This is one of my sort of favorite slides to show. So many possibilities, from acro yoga, biking yoga, boxing yoga, CrossFit yoga, yoga lattes, voga, if you're familiar with that, yoga trance dance, laughter yoga, nude yoga. We've got rave yoga here nearby us here, goat yoga, and doga. What does yoga mean in all of these different sorts of contexts? And you can imagine the sort of challenge that a scholar like Chris or I face when we try to, again, find a way to negotiate the kind of generality of yoga and its specificity. And some people go as far as saying, like, yoga is a floating signifier. Patrick McCartney, a colleague who works on sort of transnational traditions of yoga, says yoga's become a lot like the word Zen, where if you just attach that word to something else, it makes that something else special in some shape or form, even if we don't really have a strong and clear sense of what it means. But my job as a scholar is in part to try to nail that down a bit more and say, what does it mean? And what links these together? Or can we not link them together? And so what I come up with is a multi-staged way of looking at defining yoga that, again, I think provides a foundation for looking at yoga in this sort of multifaceted way. So I say here, in its primary sense, yoga is a set or system of techniques, mind-body discipline, rooted in Indian religion and philosophy, that aims to transform a practitioner into a more perfect being so as to, one, make them more powerful, and or two, to facilitate liberation from worldly affliction. And then in its secondary sense, yoga refers to specific modes and goals of practice, and thus may be qualified by compounding the term with particular categorical designations of technique, such as Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Shadanga Yoga, Mantra Yoga, Laya Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and so forth. In the modern context, such categorical designations may be supplanted by references to the progenitors of systems of yoga or schools of yoga, such as Iyengar Yoga, Shivananda Yoga, Integral Yoga, Siddha Yoga, Yantra Yoga, and so forth, each of which implies particular modes and goals of practice. And so I go on to say this relatively simple heuristic approach, in other words, this is a kind of pragmatic approach, as opposed to saying I've given a sort of a definition which is some sort of essential thing outside of the realm of thought, but rather this is I think a heuristic, pragmatic way for defining yoga, capturing some of this sense of universality within Indian notions of a goal-oriented spiritual discipline, which you find in a lot of different places, while respecting that the discipline and goals of practice may differ significantly depending on the philosophical, sectarian, or non-sectarian context in which they're developed. And so that could mean equating yoga with asceticism, or integrating asceticism into a larger framework of yoga practice, adopting particular methods like hatha yoga or bhakti yoga. And likewise, we can further qualify this as a phenomenon that exists in some cases tied to renouncer ideologies, in other cases to householder traditions, and some that seek to really mediate the two. And so just to kind of bring this point home a bit, I want to just show you a brief clip of a statement by BKS IANGER, a series of statements, which actually appears in the film Enlighten Up. I don't know if you are all familiar with this or not, which for all its faults, one of them being really portraying a kind of white male protagonist in an environment that I think probably would have been better suited, by a little bit more diverse kind of protagonist. Nonetheless, I think it does a good job of here drawing out some of Iyengar's thinking about yoga, which plugs pretty directly into this definition I just put out here. So let's take a peek at this.
What was your guru's name? T. Krishnamacharya. What were the yoga teachings that he imparted? How to keep the body under control. So you, at that time, you were just looking at purely on a physical level. Purely on a physical level. He was, no doubt, my Guruji was a great philosopher. And did he teach you that philosophy while you were? I told you, it took me 6 years after yoga to gain health. When health was not there, what can I think of philosophy? Tell me. I was struggling, just let me stand on my feet. The philosophical teaching came to me only after 1960, not before. What is the goal of yoga? By the grace of God, it's a subjective way of eradicating the instinctive weaknesses of human being. It may be quick, for some it may be slow, but change has to take place, transformation has to take place, whoever it may be, in whatever average intellectual condition they are. But asana, then, is the way you're describing it, it's a preparation for receiving the spiritual. No doubt it's a preparation, but everything is hidden in it also. Yoga can take a man into two ways of living: enjoyment of life or liberation in life. So does it not matter that it doesn't matter at all. You want to improve, I want to improve, same. Yeah. You want to be a better intelligent man, I want also to be a better intelligent man. That's a huge relief that you say that, Guruji. I'm basically a man of this earth, and I don't have much religion or anything, but lots of yoga teachers talk about how this is all a goal to connecting with this higher self and the Brahman. The channels are open both ways, I'm telling you. Yeah. This way, how you use it.
All right, so one of the things I love about this is it really gets at this idea of the dynamic in yoga in which there's an understanding that when you discipline your mind and your body, they become very powerful. But to some extent, how that is expressed can depend upon the person or the context in which it's practiced. In other words, one can use it for the sake of self-perfection, to pursue one's own ends, or one might direct it towards what we might consider more ethical, spiritual, or religious ends. And that's why in some cases I will hear people say, this particular tradition of yoga is not yoga because they're clearly centered on things like beautification or just simply stress relief or gaining strength to pursue other, corporate or other sorts of pursuits. And what I like to argue is really the history of yoga is that yoga has a kind of ambiguity to it in terms of this understanding that when you discipline your mind and body, it becomes very powerful. And it's how that power is then directed towards other activities. And there are lots of examples. And of course, David White wrote this whole book, Sinister Yogis, about the idea that yogis in some case are portrayed as people who are seeking power for power's sake. Now, I would disagree with him that that's the dominant model or that's the dominant message, but I think he has brought up something very important about it. And that's one of the reasons I really credit him for sort of helping me see a side of yoga that, otherwise might not be acknowledged within scholarship or within the practitioner context. And I think many of us who are in the American yoga community have seen this and perceived it on a certain level and noticed how people who become virtuosos in yoga practice have a certain power that they gain both personally and professionally that in some cases is used towards promoting their own and others' spiritual transformation or moral transformation, and others for whom it becomes a vehicle for achieving, let's say, more mundane goals. So we've seen Iyengar here, and he mentions his teacher Krishnamacharya. And one interesting sort of twist to this is to say that if you were to look at this definition I offered, for example, and say, oh, this is far too broad, far too wide of a net casting out to talk about yoga. There's a sort of danger that just about anything qualifies as yoga. It's interesting to look to Iyengar's teacher himself to see what he had to say about these types of things. And there's a great passage from the Yoga it should be Yoga Makaranda, I apologize here, which was translated by Narasimha and Jayashree and Mark Singleton in White's edited volume, Yoga and Practice, where Krishnamacharya himself indicates that an almost universalizing sense of yoga as disciplines of mind and body developed in various cultural contexts. So he says, but you should realize that God has created an appropriate system of educational activity according to the geographical conditions of each country and the quality of air and vegetation. That is to say, the structure of knowledge has been created in accordance with the particular characteristics of the land, water, and air. That is why each society has its own unique features and traditions and is different from others in terms of language, philosophy, culture, study, and pursuit of pleasure. We don't know what they were practicing in the past, but at present, all of you should know for sure that they are practicing the same yoga discipline as us. Now, I think that is just a really incredibly interesting statement to have one of the key figures really in the formulation of modern yoga, speaking to the notion that in various cultural contexts, there are disciplines of mind and body that are being developed that have a kind of similar function and status that the Indian systems of yoga have. And perhaps that, lent on some level to the way in which Krishnamacharya fashioned the postural practice of yoga that he taught to his students in the Mysore Palace, in conversation with both Indian disciplines like the use of the sun salutation, perhaps the Indian martial arts, as well as having access to instruction in European bodybuilding, gymnastics, and other techniques. So if we think of yoga here as a set of mind and body techniques that apply in a particular cultural context and historical moment, we can take it even further and almost even bring it out of simply talking about the Indian context to talking about some sort of larger global culture. I wasn't prepared to do that myself because I think there's something very important to recognizing the Indian roots of yoga as a kind of concept and as a discipline. And in part because when we trace back the history of yoga from what we see being done in the contemporary context, we inevitably find our way back to India. Nonetheless, Krishnamacharya himself really hinted at this idea that there's a kind of universality of yoga that really transcends time and space. All right, so let me just, I don't want to take up too much time because I definitely want to have plenty of time for discussion. Oh, great, my Adobe Flash is deciding to try to reinstall itself here. Okay, can you still see my screen? Okay, good. Let me just talk for a couple of minutes about some of the emergent issues that I think really struck me as I worked through this project. And then talk about a few things that, you know, I wish I had maybe addressed at more length. And then lastly, I want to just give you a few nuggets of the things that I'm working on now that I see to a great extent is really coming out of this project, and things that I have a feeling many of you are very interested in, and I would look forward to having a conversation about. So one issue is the question of, where do asceticism and yoga ultimately come from in the Indian historical context? And in the scholarly sphere, there's been a debate between what are called orthogenetic and heterogenetic theories. In other words, does yoga originate in the Vedic context and then develop in Jainism and Buddhism? Or is it the opposite, that yoga is somehow seeded in the Vedic or Hindu tradition by these Jain and Buddhist renouncer traditions? And one of the interesting things is, on one level, I want to say that working through this text has really made me much more deeply appreciate both the Buddhist and Jain contributions to the development of yoga. I think they're often seen as responses or reactions or adaptations of Hindu concepts and terminology. But I think really, when you look deeper, what you see is a mutual sort of engagement in which practices sort of get appropriated and reappropriated, interpreted, reinterpreted. And so I really saw myself fleshing out more my own understandings of both Buddhist and Jain yogas, in addition to kind of deepening my understanding of the Hindu yogas. On the flip side, I also found myself looking much more deeply at the Vedic sort of foundations for many of the concepts that are developed in yoga. So for example, the concept of the vratya, or vow. I think that may be a sort of a critical part of the language of asceticism and renunciation that develops in both Buddhism and Jainism, for example. I also, and I mentioned this further down, am increasingly interested in the way that psychoactive substances have been part of the picture. Whether that's soma or the visha associated with these Kaishans, these long-haired ones who are also referred to as munis, or the silent ones, which you see in the Vedic context, a kind of appeal to certain visionary experiences that can be catalyzed through the use of substances, which I think, again, is a precursor to some of the things you see later, especially in classical and medieval yoga traditions, as well as I've increasingly become aware, at least acknowledged within Buddhist traditions. Another key point is the import of mantra. And I think this is something Chris has been on to, and perhaps trying to convince people for a long time, that understanding mantra is really central to understanding the history of yoga. And I think it took doing this work for me to kind of come to that realization that I think Chris came to long ago, that the use of mantra is intimately tied up with the practice of yoga. And I would say this is not only characteristic of Hindu traditions, but also of Buddhist traditions, as well as I think later Jain traditions. Another key point is the pervasiveness of limbed systems, the Ashtanga yoga and Shadanga yoga, the 8-limbed and 6-limbed systems. In recent scholarship, there have been a number of studies that have aimed to kind of dethrone Ashtanga yoga, the 8-limbed yoga, as a paradigm for thinking about yoga. Really arguing that it has been overemphasized because of its being championed by modern proponents. But I think really what this study showed me is that it has been, the Ashtanga yoga in particular, has been kind of the dominant paradigm that everybody addresses and is frequently used as a framework for interpreting all sorts of novel practices under a kind of authoritative rubric. So I again came around to this viewpoint of saying there's probably no better starting point for understanding the practice of yoga in the Indian context than talking about Ashtanga yoga. Another element was the import of possession ritual traditions. And this is something perhaps somewhat controversial, but I think increasingly we're seeing evidence within scholarship on medieval traditions of Hatha yoga and tantric yoga that women possession ritualists were an important part of the picture. And I benefited from having an advisor who, among other things, studied women's possession ritualism in southern India, and noting especially how women's oral traditions associated with possession were a source of great power and authority for women, quite distinct from the more patriarchal priestly hierarchy. And so my argument here to some extent is that tantric traditions may well have interfaced with long-standing women's traditions. On the flip side, it's clear, and I mentioned this briefly, but it's worth kind of getting into a bit more, that as tantric traditions develop, in many cases, women who are involved as consorts are represented as women of very low caste, often very young and vulnerable. And it's hard to read those texts and see those representations and not think there was a deliberate power imbalance, at least within many of these tantric contexts, in which the women were, a kind of instrument for men's spiritual development. But that may be one part of a much larger picture. As I mentioned before, the hybridity of yoga systems, and also the way in which epic and Puranic literature, the narrative literature of the Hindu tradition, represents yoga. I think this has been understudied. Actually, I think I saw Itmar Theodore is here, who works on the Bhagavad Gita. And I really benefited actually from reading one of his texts that looks at how the Bhagavad Gita, among other things, encodes key yogic principles in a way that really parallel the development of the classical tradition. A couple of last things here, linkages between yoga and the military and martial arts. And that includes everything from the early Vratya sects to more contemporary contexts where, for example, Swami Ramdev, one of the most powerful gurus, if not the most powerful guru of yoga in the Indian context, has a program to teach Indian military cadets yogic practices as a way of informing their martial arts training. Many of you will remember in the Mahabharata, the 5 Pandavas learn yoga as a kind of accessory to their martial arts practice. Last but not least, this idea of the historicity of yoga, that there are economic and material dimensions, politics comes into the picture, gender, sexuality, institutions, and communities. And I tell you, if there are things that I wish I could have gone into more, one of them would be the sort of material dimension of yoga and how yoga is represented by the kind of physical culture and material culture in India, which is, I think, something that's a bit understudied. Actually, I think Seth Powell, who may or may not be here, is someone who's been writing about this recently. I think that provides a really important window to the culture of yoga that often is missing from more historical and philosophical scholarship. I wish I could have spent a bit more time on issues that are really emerging in the contemporary context, such as the question of commodification in yoga, as well as things like cultural appropriation, access to diverse communities, and things like that. I mean, I really give a few nuggets at, towards the end of the book about these things and try to really get them out there, as these are important issues, but these are things I would have loved to have looked at more deeply. In terms of psychoactive substances, one of the emerging sort of areas is talking about datura, which is a highly psychoactive, very dangerous substance that has been associated with Shaiva traditions and may have a link to the development of certain tantric practices. I think there's much more to be done there. So where to go from here? Well, I've got a couple of pieces that are coming out probably in the next 6 months or so. One on the origin of the sun salutation, or I should say the historical development of the Surya Namaskar. I don't think I really am at a point where I can really point to the origin as much as just talk with a little bit more sophistication about where exactly that practice came from, what its building blocks are, and how it's really encoded into Indian culture in a way that is probably not in the awareness of people who practice it in Europe and the United States. I have another paper that looks at the use of aushadhi, of certain herbs, in the development of what's called nirmana chitta, or a constructed mind, a special kind of empowered mind state that yields extraordinary capacities, that is paralleled extremely closely. Clearly, there's a borrowing going on between Patanjali Yoga and Buddhist Abhidharma that really gives us some interesting insight into the way that psychoactive substances function within the context of these yoga traditions. I'm working on a project on yoga in the Puranas, and I've had some conversations with McComas Taylor, who's an Australian scholar, and just actually wrote a very voluminous translation of the Vishnu Purana about maybe doing some sort of collaborative work there. I've become very interested in the Shveta Ashvatara Upanishad, and I'm thinking about trying to do a kind of study and translation of that, in part because of its proximity to Patanjali or classical yoga traditions in terms of concepts and practices. Some of you may know I wrote a book a while back co-authored with a yoga teacher here in Oregon, Kevin Kimple, called The 8 Limbs of Yoga Handbook for Living Yoga Philosophy. I'm writing a follow-up for that, something around the idea of the yoga of the Noble Eightfold Path, talking about the relationship between the Ashtanga 8 limbs of yoga and the Eightfold Path and how that's developed within Buddhism. I'm actually planning to present a paper in the spring at the Harvard Symposium on Yoga, Ecology, and Spirituality, and I would imagine I'm going to be consulting Chris's work closely in preparation of that paper. I'm also working on some projects related to yoga and psychedelics, both their modern history, therapeutic applications, and certification facilitation. And here's just a really interesting nugget. So in Oregon, last year we passed a bill that provides a 2-year period for developing a framework for the legal therapeutic use of psilocybin, which includes both a framework for people growing and distributing it, as well as people acting as facilitators. One of the most interesting things for me is the facilitator training. They're trying to avoid issues of access, which is of course a huge problem in any healthcare sphere, that only people within certain demographics, economically, ethnically, et cetera, are going to get access. So they really want to make it accessible. So one of the things that's been happening is they're putting together a kind of certification that looks in some respects quite like the 200-hour yoga certification, where one would get a kind of baseline amount of training that would have certain categorical designations that would then allow a person to legally procure psilocybin and use it as a facilitator. Needless to say, there's lots of interesting room for discussion and debate there. And I think I saw Amanda Lucia, who's here, who's done some really interesting and provocative work on festivals and with some, I think, discussion of psychedelics in the history of yoga culture, which is, I think, a really underexplored and fascinating area. I think we're going to see a lot more action there as, or I should say, if the second wave psychedelic movement continues to gain steam. Last but not least, I've been part of a 3-year Vedi Foundation project on looking at religion and technology. And I've been in particular looking at yoga, Buddhism as resources within biohacking communities and within larger conversations about human augmentation. And so I've got a couple of projects. One's called Technologies of the Self, which is like the more academic piece. And I'm sort of envisioning another book called Tune In, Turn On, Step Up, which sort of takes the old Leary maxim and kind of turns it around a little bit to think about, you know, how spiritual practices, psychedelics, and other sorts of vehicles can be a means not only for transforming oneself, but also can we situate this in a kind of pro-social way that really opens up doors for creativity for solving the sorts of looming, if not already existing, problems that we face as a civilization. All right, so that I'm going to stop there so we have plenty of time to have a conversation, and I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
Great. So I think the best way to proceed is for probably Stuart to end the share screen, and then the screen will populate with people who have empowered their camera. And let's do it both ways. Let's invite people to write into the chat. And also, please consider speaking up, either raising your hand or just speaking, unmuting yourself and asking a question. And I want to ask the first question if I can. And it's about the 200-hour psilocybin facilitation training. Do people need, is it anticipated that people will need to be psychotherapists, or will this be a standalone training to maximize access?
Yeah, again, I think the ball is still sort of in the air on that question. But from what I've seen so far, and I've been working on this actually with an undergraduate student who's really looking, her focus has been actually issues of access, sort of looking at access to healthcare in general, emergent therapies more specifically, and then this new psilocybin therapy as a kind of case study in access by Black, Indigenous, and people of color to healthcare here in the country. And so we've been looking a lot together at, they've got a diversity and equity section, and so they've been helping formulate a plan on how that's going to be a part of the picture. But I think in order to forward access, I think the bar is going, at least right now, it looks like the bar is going to be lower than having some sort of therapeutic certification, that it will be something therapists can do additionally to be able to legally facilitate within their practice. But I think, at least as it's being envisioned right now, and of course I haven't looked the past week or two, so things could have changed, but the way it was going was really thinking in terms of what is a minimum amount of training in terms of sort of history, things like facilitation training, dealing with potential negative experiences, etc., that a person would need to be able to manage this without the need for an advanced degree, psychological training, etc.
And for those who may not be aware, at Johns Hopkins University and other places, several years ago, they began to bring about access to psilocybin for people that were from various populations, most specifically the terminally ill. And one of my old yoga friends from 40 years ago, who is no more, but had a pretty virulent form of cancer, and said, "Oh, I'm going to need this." But you had to go through these testings, and they said, "Well, you're really at peace with the fact you're going to die." And they denied him participation, and they were looking for people that were actually highly anxious in order to, test the benefits of this hallucinogenic experience.
And Chris, it's interesting to note that Roland Griffith, who's often credited with kind of taking this very sober approach to the topic, he'd been a researcher on drugs and addiction for many decades, was highly respected in the field, and sort of took this up in a very kind of sober and deliberate way. He nonetheless, many people aren't aware, was a practitioner of Siddha yoga. Mm-hmm. And so he's got, he had, I'm guessing, some experience in kind of ecstatic states through some of the Siddha yoga practice. And I don't know what his personal story is, if he kind of fell out, as many people did, when there was a bit of a crisis and controversy in that community, if not a scandal. And so I look at that and I say, he's clearly coming from a background where he's got some personal experience with this. He's kept it out of the sphere of his professional life. But he has been a huge champion for the idea that the people who benefit from these therapies the most are also the people who claim to have had a mystical or religious experience of some sort, that the most profound changes happen to the people who feel like they've had the most profound experiences. It's very intriguing on many levels, I think.
Yeah, I'll share one more story, then we need to move on to probably other sorts of questions, but this was also made available widely to physicians, and we have a physician friend who signed up, was completely ecstatic, felt repaired, felt wholeness, felt all of those wonderful spiritual moments, and then said, "And I would never, ever do it again," which reminded me actually of Houston Smith. And Houston Smith, the famous scholar of religion, was known to have taken LSD. And when asked about his use of entheogens, he was about 90 years old, the recipient of our Doshi Bridge Builder Award. He said pretty much the same thing, that, when you answer the phone and you get the message, then you hang up and you carry on with your life. So you can tell I'm on the sober side of this whole enterprise. And I've always been fascinated because, of course, our students have been part of this movement even during those years when no one was talking about this at all. So, okay, so let's open it up to other questions. And I don't want us to get stuck on this issue. And here we go. Christine, could you unmute and let everyone hear your question?
Yes, I was really interested by the Krishnamacharya quote. I've read 2 books about him and studied with a number of people that were not direct students, but students of his students. And I know that he changed how he taught the physical practice, at least, after he had his first Western middle-aged male student, Dr. Albert Franklin. So I'm wondering if the date of that quote is maybe after he had him as a student. And so it's not just the physical practice, but just yoga in a broader sense as well.
Oh, do you happen to know the year? Yoga Makaranda, I think, was originally published in 1934.
Oh. So
I think it's within the parameters of his Mysore Palace phase. And so that is a really interesting point, and clearly he had already been exposed in the context of the Mysore Palace to European physical cultures and some of the kind of adaptations that were going on. One of his, according to some mentors, was K.V. Iyer, who was a very famous Indian bodybuilder, who was a student of Eugene Sandow, who's considered the sort of the father of the modern male physique. So there were, he may well have been having some influences there, whether it was early or late, in relation to these other influences, I'm not sure. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'll take up this question here from Gayatri Segal. If every culture had yoga already, what was the need to spread Indian-rooted yoga by Krishnamacharya and others? I had that sort of same question when I read it as well, that on a certain level, it does sort of speak to this, almost like a Sanatana Dharma kind of notion that there's an order to the universe and people are going to attune to it wherever and whenever they are, or something to that effect. And so why would he spread yoga then to others? And that's a really interesting and complex question. I mean, one thread you could go down is sort of the question of, did he really want to, at least initially? And so, for example, I think, I'm not sure if any of you have read Elizabeth Kadetsky's book, First There Is a Mountain, which is a sort of kind of kiss and tell book about a journey through the world of Iyengar yoga. She claims in conversations with Iyengar that Krishnamacharya was sort of both unhappy and jealous of Iyengar's success internationally, and that there was some question about whether Krishnamacharya really wanted yoga to be, extended to this sort of global audience or not. And so if we look at that issue, that maybe both complicates the picture of Krishnamacharya and Iyengar's relationship, and sort of points to maybe Krishnamacharya, at least initially, being more inwardly focused or facing. I think Desikachar makes some arguments too that Krishnamacharya, opened up his practice to a broader audience, both women and non-Indian students, with, to some degree, a kind of pragmatism about needing to preserve yoga in a time where it was being challenged, and that, sharing those teachings might not be ideal, but it's a way of preserving the tradition. In fact, I use a quote, there's I'm trying to think of this, Yoga Unveiled. I don't know if any of you have seen this documentary, but Desikachar makes a statement in there about how forward-thinking Krishnamacharya was about women, allowing them to participate in the practice. But at one point he makes a statement about to the effect of, because he was worried yoga was going to die out. So sort of maybe conditions a bit the degree to which one can look at, Krishnamacharya as a feminist, let's say. So there may be a bit of a pragmatism to that direction that he took as well. Does that help, or do you want to respond, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it does help. But then I'm curious about like the need to preserve, if there's like the as you mentioned, the greater order of things, then why any need to take action or preserve? But I guess that's like a question you can endlessly keep asking. I actually had another, I don't know if there are other questions, but I had a question about your book, within the book, about Patanjali, and why you chose like the word his instead of, because I've seen in other situations that it's like well, it's not really clear. It might be a bunch of yogis all together, that it was a school. And I noticed in your book, you chose to go with like the representation of it was a he and one person, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky issue. I mean, anytime you're talking about, an ancient or classical text, the issues, there are all sorts of issues about authorship and representation. And I tried to some extent to bring to light some of the debates, for example, about whether, for example, the Sutrapata, the kind of sutra text itself and the principal commentary was a sort of a single authored compilation, let's say, which is something that Philip Maas, who's a sort of one of the premier German scholars of yoga, has argued very significantly. I think there are a few things that led me to just sort of, at least personify that one author. One is kind of a recognition of how Patanjali is represented within the tradition itself, among other things, as Patanjali being a particular male who was a manifestation of Adishesha, a king of the Nagas who took on human form to disseminate this knowledge, as well as other passages that claim that Patanjali was this, polymath who taught Indian medicine and grammar as well as yoga. So that's a very unitive vision of Patanjali, both as a scholar, but also as a figure who relates to the sort of theological conceptions within the Hindu tradition. But I think you're right. It's, as a more of a, textual sort of, from the viewpoint of textual criticism, it's really hard to do anything like document who Patanjali was. And actually, Jerry Larson does this a bit in his Encyclopedia of Indian Religions on the yoga philosophy. And there's not a lot there to really work with. In fact, he leans towards the idea, he was a Sankhya philosopher, Vidyavasan, actually, who perhaps was somehow credited with was identified as Patanjali in part to give him authority, as would be linked with the grammarian Patanjali. So it's a complex issue. And I would say if the more subtle nuances of that, I think you would find more in the footnotes to that chapter. But for coherence, to some extent, I relied more on the way that tradition represents him as a unitive figure. Now, I will say this, a few years ago, I gave a talk at the Dharma Association of North America, in which I said, when I read the first pada of the Yoga Sutra, there's a part, verses basically 123 forward, where it would almost make sense to swap some of those verses around. And needless to say, there were a couple of scholars in the audience who did not like that one bit, because it sort of struck them as a kind of Orientalist, re-envisioning and undermining of the authority of the Indian author. So it's tricky, and there are many, I think, different approaches to that topic.
Great. I know Lori, Dr. Lori Fazio posted a question, and either you could read it from the chat,
Okay.
Stuart, or Lori could speak up.
Okay, so would love to hear your insights on Swami Vedabharati taught yoga as compared to the more postural approaches of the Krishnamacharya lineage. Studied a bit with Swami Veda and found the Himalayan tradition more overtly focused on subtle body and then Tara Angas. Yeah, and actually that was my experience as well, that it probably of the various Hindu ashrams I've been to over time, probably the ashram that was the most focused on, as you were saying, the Antara Angas, developing dhyana, as a kind of central practice. One of the first sessions I sat in on was more or less him helping us get comfortable sitting, but then almost all of it was focused on doing a kind of guided dhyana practice with very little postural yoga. The individual training I got was mainly how to sit comfortably. And they did a kind of Burmese style posture with this one sort of cross-legged with the one leg in front, at least to start. Some basic pranayama, but the real focus was on meditation. And that's one of the things I try to bring out a bit in that last chapter, sort of drawing from Elizabeth D. Michaelis's, categories of modern yoga. I think this dynamic between modern postural yoga, modern meditative yoga is really useful. And I would put, for example, the transcendental meditation tradition associated with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for example, much more in that meditative sphere as well. Much of the work of the groups that Chris was talking about, the Vedanta Society, is a more sort of knowledge and meditation focused than really focused on the postural types of yoga. So yeah, I wish I had had more experience. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago now, but a really intriguing community.
Yeah, I met him shortly before he went into silence. I think he was in silence for a couple of years before he transitioned, intentionally. But when he didn't teach asana himself, but the ones who taught for him, it was still very meditative. In fact, you weren't allowed to progress an asana unless you could maintain a 6-count inhale, exhale throughout the entire matching all the movements. So most of us didn't get very far with our asana practice. And even people who had learned a lot in the Krishnamacharya lineage, he would come in and he would get very, critical of postural yoga and tell us that wasn't yoga. And so, that's not yoga what you're doing, even though, it's all yoga, as you're pointing out, yoga is vast. So yeah, I was curious your thoughts on that, because so much attention goes to the Krishnamacharya lineages. And there are several of these other lineages that you're mentioning that have such a different approach on it. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I think, the late 20th century, we really saw a kind of shift in focus towards those postural traditions of yoga that in some respects really pushed the meditative traditions out of the spotlight, with some exceptions. I mean, I would think of Siddha Yoga, for example, as a very meditatively focused tradition, but more from a sort of a tantric perspective. And clearly TM, though, perhaps, never reclaiming the glory it had in the late 60s and 70s, nonetheless has had some really prominent, vocal celebrities in the past 10 years. And I think there's been, I've definitely seen both more attention in the public sphere on TM, as well as encountering more students who have experienced TM again than I have in maybe the past 10 or 15 years. So it might be one of those things where the pendulum swings a bit back and forth as well. One of the things, though, that I found so interesting about Swami Vedabharati's community was there were a lot of students playing important roles within the organization who are from South Korea. And, it was very sort of interesting to see how much of an impact he had made in that part of the world, where clearly he had a very substantial following and disciples who had been around long enough to really taken on positions of authority as well. So very multicultural community. In fact, it's interesting, or one of the interesting things I see, often I go into these environments, partially as a practitioner because I'm very interested in, learning the techniques, but I can never quite get my sort of ethnographer, anthropologist hat off either. And I'll notice these things like, wow, this community is highly integrated. Like Swami Vedabharati's, you had sort of Europeans, you had Indian students, you had students from Korea, all really integrated in a way, whereas in other yoga communities, you'll see like there's one class for the sort of Anglo-American students, there's a separate class for Indian students. And in some cases, what you find is the Anglo-American students are actually subsidizing through their higher fees the instruction of the Indian students. Or you might find a case where there are almost no Indian students at all, or if there are any, they're very highly cosmopolitan, literate, and often, higher sort of upper middle to upper class members of the community. And that tells you a lot about the way that, these communities work.
Well, I think that that's a very fine note to end with, emphasizing the malleability, emphasizing really the spirit of welcome within the Vedabharati community. And I'm also smiling a little bit extra special because I left that community on March 11th, 2020, and came right back to the United States and have not left the US since. And it's been, the couple of years now. And those of us who are able to return to travel, it's still a wonderful community, even in his absence, that I would suggest, if you're able to get to Rishikesh, that you might want to visit there. And I have a big, long list. So I want to, first of all, thank Stuart. I think we got a taste of the book that I know you can easily find, and his name is right there on the screen, and we all know how to order things these days. It's also the ebook available for those of you that are LMU students. And I also invite you to return next month, November 17th. We have Dr. Laura Cornell Yogeshwari, who will be talking about her current book on the moon salutation. And Laura and I traveled through India together doing trainings on yoga and ecology in all different locations. She did her graduate work at the California Institute for Integral Studies. And before that, she was a physics teacher. So I hope that you're able to register, tune in for that. And Stuart, if you have any questions, you can find him on the Oregon State website. And if you have any questions about yoga programs here at Loyola Marymount University, feel free to explore our websites and send us an email and come perhaps to some online information sessions that are coming up. So I'm wondering if Amy is here, if Amy would like to close out the evening, and if Amy has moved on, then we'll linger in a little bit of silence. Okay, so one inhale and an exhale. Another inhale and an exhale. And one last inhale and an exhale as we go forward into our lives, appreciative of Professor Sarbacker. Thank you so much, Stuart.
Thank you so much for having me.